On the high benches of the Lasta country, in the north-central reach of the Ethiopian plateau, where the land lifts itself a little above 2,600 meters into thin, bright air, there is a slope of reddish ground that holds, sunk into its own bedrock, the carved churches of a town named for a king. The country here is not flat, and it is not gentle, for the plateau has been cut and folded by the long work of water into ridges that run one behind another, into deep valleys where seasonal streams gather in the rains and lie dry through the long months after, and into rounded shoulders of rock where the soil thins to nothing and the stone shows through. The stone that shows through is a soft volcanic tuff, a welded scoria laid down by eruptions older than any memory the place carries, reddish-brown where it is fresh and graying where the weather has had its way with it, soft enough that an iron tool bites it cleanly, and firm enough that, once the air has hardened its outer skin, it stands for centuries against the rain. From the upper edge of the site, the ground falls away to the north toward the great drainage of the Tekeze, that river system that gathers the highland waters and carries them down at last toward the lowlands and the deserts beyond. And in the other directions the ridges rise again, so that the place sits in a kind of long, shallow trough on the side of the mountains, sheltered and yet open to the sky. The light at this elevation is a particular thing, hard and clear in the dry season when the sun stands high and the shadows lie sharp across the rock, softer in the months of rain when cloud gathers against the heights and the whole country goes green for a season before browning again. The air is cool the year round, cool enough in the dry season nights that frost whitens the grass on the open ground, and the breath of the cattle hangs visible at dawn, and warm enough by midday under the strong sun that the rock holds the heat and gives it back slowly into the evening. Around the carved town, the slopes were worked for grain, for the barley and the wheat and the small hardy cereals that the highland farmers have grown here for a very long time, and the higher ground was grazed by cattle and by the goats that find their footing on the steep places. Eucalyptus did not yet stand here in those centuries, for that tree came late to the highlands, and the slopes carried instead the older cover of juniper and wild olive and the thorned acacia of the drier faces, thinned already by generations of cutting and grazing into the open patchwork that the place still wears. The town that grew around the churches carried in those days the name of Roha, and the country immediately about it belonged to the heartland of the highland kings of the age, a region of high cold farmland set among some of the tallest ground in the whole of Ethiopia. To the north and east, the land climbs further still, toward the great massif of Abuna Yosef, whose ridges rise well above 4,000 meters into a zone of frost and giant lobelia and the thin grass of the high moorland, and from those heights the cold air drains down at night into the valleys where the churches lie. The worked slopes about the town were in places shaped into low terraces that held the thin soil against the steepness and against the scouring of the rains, and the streams that the wet season filled ran down through the cut valleys toward the larger drainages, gathering at last into the system of the Tekeze that carries the highland water away to the north and west. It is a country of long views and hard ground, of high cold mornings and strong middays, of soil won in patches from a steep stony land, and the carved town sits in the lap of it, not on a height for the seeing, but in a fold of the slope, sunk into the rock of a country whose whole character is height and cold, and the welded red stone showing through the worked and grazed ground. The eye that follows the land from the heights finds first the green or brown of the worked slopes, and then the gray lines of the rock where it breaks the surface, and then, only on coming close, the pits and trenches cut down into that rock, for the churches do not rise against the sky as a built town would rise. They lie below the level of the surrounding ground, set into the earth rather than upon it, so that a traveler might walk across the upper slope and come almost to the edge of a great squared pit before the carved roof of a church showed itself, level with the soles of the feet, sunk into the highland as a seal is sunk into wax. The place keeps that quality still, the quality of a town that must be looked down into rather than up at. A settlement folded into the bedrock of a cool high country that has held it, with very little change to the shape of the stone, across the long turning of the centuries. And over all of it lies the particular silence of the highlands at this height. A silence not of emptiness, for the place has never been empty, but of distance. The sounds of the slope carrying far in the thin air, and then giving way to the wind moving over the rock and the long quiet that the mountains keep. The land surrounds the carved churches the way a setting surrounds a stone, and the first thing to understand about the place is not the churches at all, but the ground they were taken from, the reddish tuff of the Lasta heights, the worked and grazed slopes, the deep valleys and the cold, clear air, the whole high country of which the sunk town is a part, and from which it was, quite literally, carved. The churches were made by subtraction. Where other builders raise walls course upon course, setting one stone or one brick above another until a roof can be laid across the top, the makers of this place worked in the opposite direction, beginning with the solid rock and taking away from it everything that was not the church, so that what stands at the end is a single continuous mass of stone, roof and walls and columns and floor, all of one body, freed from the bedrock but never separated from the geology that bore it. The method can still be read in the rock itself, for the marks of it survive on every surface. The workers began at the top, on the level of the surrounding ground, and cut a deep rectangular trench down into the tuff on all four sides of the place where a church was to stand, quarrying out the soft scoria in great quantity until a freestanding block of rock was left isolated in the middle of a squared pit, joined to the parent stone only at its base. That block was the church in the rough, and from it the carvers then took away the rest, dressing the outer faces into walls and string courses and the frames of doors and windows, and then entering through the cut doorways to hollow the inside, carving the nave and the side aisles, the piers and the arches that spring between them, the flat or vaulted ceilings, the raised platform of the sanctuary at the eastern end. Because the work went from the top downward and from the outside inward, there was no room for correction, for a column cut too thin could not be thickened again, and a ceiling cut too low could not be raised, and the precision the carvers held across these depths of solid rock is the central fact of the place. 11 churches were made in this way, not all of them alike, for some were cut entirely free of the rock on every side, and stand as true monoliths in their pits, while others were left joined to the cliff along one wall, or carved back into a rock face so that they are caves dressed into the form of churches rather than blocks standing clear. Beit Medhane Alam, the house of the Savior of the world, is the largest of them and the largest rock-hewn church known anywhere. A great rectangular monolith ringed on all four sides by rows of square pillars that carry a sloped roof, so that it stands in its pit like a temple of columns, its interior a forest of carved piers dividing the space into nave and aisles. Beit Mariam, the House of Mary, stands near it in the same northern group, smaller and more richly worked within, its ceiling carved with patterned reliefs, and its walls bearing the traces of paint, its windows cut in shapes that throw figured light across the interior through the hours of the day. The two groups of churches, the northern cluster and the eastern, are divided by a watercourse cut into the rock, and set apart from both, alone on a terrace to the south, stands the most completely realized of all the carvings, Beit Georgis, the House of St. George. That church was cut as a cross. From the level of the ground, a deep squared pit was quarried down, and in the middle of it, the carvers left a great block, which they shaped into a cruciform tower, a Greek cross in plan rising sheer from the floor of the pit, its roof carved on top with the same cross repeated in relief, so that the church reads as a cross, whether the eye comes to it across the ground and looks down onto the roof, or descends into the pit and stands at the foot of the walls. There is no scaffolding in a work of this kind, and there is no foundation to be laid, for the building was never assembled, and so could never settle or lean, and the only access to Beti Georgis is along a trench cut sloping down through the rock and through a short tunnel that brings the walker out at the base of the cross. The carvers did not work in a single manner across all 11 churches, for some of them imitate in the cut rock the forms of the older-built architecture of the highlands, the manner of the ancient northern city of Aksum, with its walls of stone and timber laid in alternating courses. In Beit Anuel, the house of Emmanuel, a freestanding monolith of the eastern group, the outer walls are carved into projecting and recessed bands that copy in solid stone the look of the old building method, in which the ends of timber beams stood proud of the masonry, so that a wall that was cut whole from the rock is dressed to resemble a wall that was built up of wood and stone together. Blind windows and carved friezes run across the faces of several of the churches, doorways framed in the old Highland manner, string courses and molded bands that have no use but the eye, all of them subtracted from the rock by carvers who held in mind the built forms they were copying. Others of the 11 are not monoliths at all, but cave churches, hewn back into a rock face and dressed within into the form of a church, while remaining joined to the cliff along one side or above, as Bede Abba Libanos is left attached at its roof to the rock from which it was cut, and Beta Gabriel Rufael presents a tall carved facade across a deep trench, its interior a warren of cut chambers. So the 11 range from the wholly freed monolith standing clear in its pit to the church that is little more than a dressed cave, and across that range runs the one method, the cutting away of the rock toward a form held in the mind, and the one material, the soft red tuff of the heights. Across all the churches, the surfaces carry the record of the tools that made them. The close parallel grooves of the chisels worked over the ceilings and the walls, the dressed faces of the columns, the cut channels for drainage, the sockets and rebates where wooden doors once hung. Windows were carved in tiers, the lower ones plain, and the upper ones worked into crosses and into the interlaced forms that the Highland craft favored. And within, the rock was shaped into everything a church required, the altars and the screens, the raised sanctuaries, the recesses for burial and for the keeping of holy things. To stand inside one of these churches is to stand within a single stone hollowed into a room, the ceiling and the floor and the 4 walls and the columns between them all continuous, no joint anywhere, no mortar, no separate block, the whole interior carved as one body out of the soft red tuff of the mountain, lit by the daylight that falls down the trenches and in through the cut windows, and holding in the cool of the rock the steady temperature of the deep ground from which it was never quite cut loose. Before the sun has cleared the eastern ridge, while the floor of every pit still lies in shadow, and the frost of the dry season night still whitens the open ground above, the clergy gather in the rock interiors for the office of the dawn. The day in the carved town begins not with the field, but with the liturgy, for this was made and kept as a holy place, a town of priests and deacons, and the families that served them. And the first sound to fill the sunk courts is the sound of chant carrying up out of the rock into the cold air. In the dim interiors, the deacons move first, carrying the hand crosses of worked metal, lighting the lamps set into the wall niches and the candles that stand before the painted figures, drawing back the curtains that screen the sanctuary at the eastern end where the most sacred objects are kept. The priests follow, robed, taking their places in the carved bays, and the chant begins, the long modal singing of the Ethiopian church in the old language of Gayes, carried on the steady beat of a drum and the dry shaking of the sistrum, a singing that does not hurry and does not rise to any climax, but moves forward in its slow, measured way through the prayers of the morning. At the heart of each church, screened behind its curtain in the most sacred recess, stands the tablet, the carved tablet that stands for the Ark of the Old Scriptures, and that gives the church its consecration, never seen by the ordinary faithful, and tended only by the priests, and the whole orientation of the dawn office turns toward that screened center. Among the clergy stand the learned cantors, the keepers of the chant and of the long-trained art of the church song, leaning on the tall prayer staff that bears the weight of the body through the standing hours of the liturgy, marking the slow time of the singing with the sistrum held in the hand. The chant is antiphonal, one side of the choir answering the other across the hollowed nave, the drum setting a heartbeat under the words, the prayer staff swaying gently in time, and the sound builds not toward any peak, but into a steady woven texture that fills the rock and holds the hour. The light by now is finding the lower windows, and the smoke of the lamps and the candles hangs in level bands across the carved interior, and the smell of the beeswax and the incense thickens as the censer is swung, the gray smoke rising past the painted figures toward the chiseled ceiling. The sound fills the hollowed stone and then spills out of the doorways and up the trenches, and a person standing on the ground above, on the level of the worked slopes, hears it rising out of the earth itself, out of the pits where the church roofs lie level with the soil. As the light grows and finds its way down the trenches and in through the tiers of cut windows, the work of the morning begins around the liturgy and beneath it. Water has gathered in the night, the runoff of dew and of any rain, and it is led away along the cut gutters and the graded channels that the carvers worked into the floors of the courts, drawn off toward the rock-cut wells and cisterns, so that it does not stand against the soft walls. Servants and the younger clergy sweep the rock floors, worn already smooth by the passage of feet, and carry water up from the cisterns in vessels of clay and of worked gourd, and tend the small fires, whose smoke rises thin and pale from the dwellings, and the hermit cells that line the upper trenches and the faces of the surrounding cliffs. For the town is not only its churches. Along the trenches and in the rock above them are cut and built the cells where the monks and the older priests live, the small chambers where pilgrims lodge, the houses of the families whose work is the keeping of the place. And from these the morning brings the ordinary signs of a settlement waking, the smoke and the voices, and the smell of roasting grain, and of the flat sourdough bread baking on its iron plate. Outside the holy precincts, on the worked slopes, the farmers of the surrounding land are already at their fields in the planting and the harvest seasons, but within the pits and trenches the morning belongs to a different kind of work. The slow, attentive labor of tending a sacred place, the sweeping and the drawing of water and the lighting of lamps, all of it carried on beneath the chant that does not stop. Pilgrims who have come up from the lowlands, who have walked for days along the highland roads to reach the carved town, rise in their lodgings and make their way to the churches, moving down the trenches and through the cut tunnels from one church to the next, pausing at the carved thresholds, touching the worn stone, joining the standing crowds at the doorways where the chant is loudest. The morning light moves down the walls as the sun climbs, finding the painted ceilings of Beit Mariam, falling across the forest of piers in Beit Medhane Alam, lying at last on the floor of the great pit where Beit Georgis stands, so that the cross-shaped shadow of the church shortened slowly across the rock through the climbing hours. And through all of it, the temperature of the deep stone holds steady, cool against the warming air, so that to step from the bright, cold courtyard into the carved interior is to step into a stillness that the season does not reach. The even coolness of the rock, the smell of beeswax and of old smoke and of the lamp oil, the sound of the chant folding back on itself in the hollowed stone. This is the ordinary morning of the place, repeated through the long succession of its days. The liturgy and the lamps and the swept floors, the smoke from the cells and the water led away down the cut channels, the pilgrims moving from church to church through the trenches, the whole sunk town waking into its work beneath the slow, unhurried singing that rises out of the rock and carries up into the high, cold air. The single material that mattered in the making of the place was the rock from which the place was made. And to understand the churches is to understand the tuff. It is a volcanic scoria, a stone formed of the ash and the cinder of old eruptions welded together into a soft reddish mass, fine enough in its grain to take a clean carved edge, and even enough in its body that a carver could work it in any direction without the splitting and the flaking that harder and more layered stones impose. Freshly cut, it is soft, soft enough that an iron chisel bites it readily, and a determined worker can move a great volume of it in a day. And this softness is what made the whole undertaking possible, for no people could have hollowed 11 churches out of granite with the tools of the age. But the same stone, once the cut surface has been exposed to the air and the seasons for a time, hardens at its skin into a durable crust that turns the rain and holds the carved form, so that the softness that allowed the carving and the firmness that preserved it are two faces of the one material, the welded scoria of the Lasta Heights. The carvers read the rock as they worked, finding the harder seams and the softer, the flaws that would not bear a thin column, and the sound bodies of stone that would carry a span. And they shaped their churches to the stone they had, leaving the columns thick enough to stand, and the ceilings deep enough to hold. The tools were of iron, the chisels and the picks and the levers that the highland smiths forged from metal traded up from the lowland sources. And the craft was a craft of removal, of knowing how much stone to leave and how much to take, of cutting always toward a form that was already imagined in the solid block and could never be added back to once it was cut away. The waste was enormous. To free a single church from the rock and then to hollow it within was to quarry out many times the church's own volume in broken tuff, and all of that broken stone was carried up out of the pits and trenches in baskets, load upon load upon load, by lines of workers climbing the cut ramps and the trench sides, and spread across the slope and tipped into the valleys, so that the ground around the churches is in part a made ground, the tailings of the carving heaped and weathered into the land. Beyond the rock itself, the place used little, for there was little it needed. Timber was worked but sparingly, for the doors that hung in the carved openings and for the wooden fittings within, the carved screens and the boxes and the staves, and above all for the processional crosses and the hand crosses that the craft of the highlands made with such care, some of wood and some of cast and worked metal, carried in the liturgy and kept among the treasures of the churches. Lime was burned and slaked into plaster, and on that plaster, across some of the interior walls and ceilings, painters laid the figures of the saints and the scenes of Scripture in earth colors, the reds and the yellows and the blacks of mineral pigment, so that the bare carved stone gave way in places to painted surface. The rock dressed not only into the form of a church, but into the colors of one. The same earth colors filled the books of the churches, for the highland craft of the manuscript was old and accomplished, the leaves cut and scraped from goatskin into parchment, the Gospels and the Psalters and the lives of the saints written out by hand in the old letters of Guise, bound between wooden boards and kept among the treasures of the rock interiors. The inks and the paints of those books came from the same world of materials as the wall paintings. The soot black and the ochre red and the orpiment yellow, ground and bound and laid on the prepared skin, and the great service books lay open on their stands through the long offices, the cantors reading the chant from them by lamplight. The iron of the tools came up from sources in the wider highlands and the lowland trade, smelted and forged by smiths whose craft stood a little apart from the ordinary run of the community, and the metal of the crosses and the censers and the small bells was worked silver and bronze, cast and chased into the forms the liturgy required. Beneath all of it lay the geology itself, the welded scoria laid down in beds of differing hardness, and the carvers reading those beds chose where to set a column and where to open a window, working the sounder stone and avoiding the seams that would not bear, so that even the placing of the churches in the rock was a reading of the material from which they were subtracted. Cloth came in by trade for the hangings and the vestments and the curtains of the sanctuary, and metal beyond the tools, the worked silver and the bronze of the crosses and the censers and the small bells, and beeswax for the candles, and oil for the lamps, and the vessels of fired clay that every household and every church required for the carrying of water and the keeping of grain. But all of these were things brought to the place or made beside it, secondary to the one great material fact, which is that the churches themselves are not made of anything brought to the site at all. They are made of the site. They are the rock of the Lasta heights with the surplus taken away, the reddish tuff carved down into the shape of a town, and the whole craft that raised them was the craft of subtraction, worked patiently and without the possibility of error across years upon years of cutting, the iron biting the soft scoria, the baskets climbing the trenches, the carved form emerging from the solid stone, exactly as far as the carvers chose to free it, and no further. The carved town did not stand apart from the world, for all that it was folded into the high rock of an interior plateau, and the roads that climbed to it carried the same long traffic that had moved across the Ethiopian highlands and down to the coast for 1,000 years before the churches were cut. The kingdom whose kings raised the churches was a highland power, its wealth resting on the grain and the cattle of the cool plateau, and on its command of the routes that joined the interior to the Red Sea. And along those routes came the things the highlands did not make, and went out the things the highlands had in surplus. From the great salt depression of the Afar to the east, that searing low country where the crust of the old sea lies white under the sun, came the salt, cut in standardized bars from the salt pans, and carried up the escarpment on the backs of camels and then of pack animals into the cool highlands, where it served as a good and as a measure of value both, a currency in bar form that moved through the markets and bound the lowland and the highland economies together. From the lowland trade came incense, and the resins burned in the censers, and cloth, and the glazed wares, and the glass that the excavations of highland sites recover, the goods of a wider world reaching the interior by relay along the roads. Iron came up the same way, the metal from which the smiths forged the very chisels that cut the churches, and gold moved through the kingdom from the workings of the south and west toward the coast and the markets beyond the sea. The salt bars themselves were a thing of standard size and known worth, the emole of the highland markets, cut to a length and a weight that the trade agreed upon, so that a load of them was at once a quantity of salt and a quantity of value, carried by the long camel caravans up out of the furnace heat of the Afar and broken into the smaller pack trains of mules and donkeys for the climb into the cool heights. The ports of the Red Sea coast and the islands offshore gathered the seaborne trade and passed it inland along the escarpment roads. The glazed wares and the glass and the fine cloth moving up, the gold and the ivory and the other goods of the interior moving down, and the highland kingdom sitting astride the inland end of that long exchange. Bound into the same northern current was the church itself, for the highland Christians received the head of their church, the Abun, from the patriarch of the Egyptian church at Alexandria, a single bishop sent south into the highlands to ordain the clergy and to hold the line of the faith, so that along the roads that carried the salt and the cloth there moved also the slow traffic of doctrine and of office. The Highland Church joined across the deserts and the sea to the older churches of Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. The kingdom stood in a long and living contact with the Christian world to the north, with the Church of Egypt from which it received the head of its own church and the slow currents of doctrine and of art, and with the eastern Mediterranean beyond, so that the liturgical objects and the forms of the churches and the very idea that shaped the carved town all flowed in along the same channels that carried the salt and the cloth and the iron. For the carved town was, in its conception, an answer to a problem of travel. The older Jerusalem, the holy city of the scriptures toward which the Christian world turned, lay far to the north across ground that the changing powers of the age had made hard and dangerous for highland pilgrims to cross, and the making of a new holy city in the rock of the Lasta heights was in part a way of bringing the destination home, of setting the geography of the Holy Land into the home country so that the pilgrimage could be made without the long and perilous road. In that sense, the churches are themselves a kind of trade, a substitution, the import not of goods but of a sacred geography, the Jordan and the Bethlehem and the Golgotha, carried in idea up from the distant land and cut into the near rock. And so the roads that climbed to the carved town carried two kinds of traffic that were not in the end so different: the salt and the iron and the cloth and the glazed wares of the ordinary exchange, and the pilgrims themselves, walking up from the lowlands and from the far reaches of the kingdom to a holy city that had been made near, so that the far one need not be reached. The markets that served the town drew the produce of the surrounding slopes, the grain and the pulses and the honey and the cattle and the goods of the long routes, and the place that looked from a distance like a withdrawn and self-contained thing, a town sunk into its own rock, was in fact a knot in a wide net of movement, fed by the salt of the eastern deserts and the iron of the trade and the slow, steady coming of pilgrims along the highland roads. The wealth that paid for the carving, the labor of the workers fed through the long years of the cutting, rested on this command of land and root, on the grain of the plateau and the salt of the roots, and the gold that moved through toward the sea, and the carved churches stand as the most lasting form into which that wealth was ever put. The surplus of a highland kingdom turned not into walls of stacked stone, but into the hollowed rock of a holy city. A Jerusalem set into the heights at the inland end of the roads that ran down to the sea. As the sun goes down behind the western ridges and the light leaves the floors of the pits, the courts of the carved town fill again, for the day that began with the office of the dawn closes with the office of the evening, and the clergy return to the rock interiors as the working hours end. The lamps are lit a second time, the candles set into the wall niches kindled against the gathering dark, and the light of them moves across the painted ceilings and the carved arches and the worn faces of the columns, throwing the figures of the saints into a shifting glow and laying long shadows down the hollowed naves. The evening chant begins, the same slow modal singing of the morning, the drum and the sistrum marking the time, and once more the sound rises out of the rock and carries up the trenches into the cooling air, so that the sunk town at dusk is again a town that sings from below the level of the ground. The same period of the day belongs also to the ordinary closing of the settlement, for in the cells along the trenches and in the rock chambers above, the hermits and the older priests take the single substantial meal of their day, now that the light is going, the flat sourdough injera and the pulses cooked with spice, the roasted grain and the honey of the highlands, eaten in the small lamplit rooms, while the chant comes faint through the rock from the churches. On the days of fasting, which fall across much of the year in the calendar of the Highland Church, the meal is plainer still, the pulses and the bread without the butter and the meat that the fasting sets aside, and the long discipline of the fast shapes the evening table as it shapes the year. In the cells, the monks turn after the meal to their own private prayer, the muttered psalms and the telling of the prayer cord, and the older among them, whose eyes have weakened, lean on the prayer staff even in the small rooms, for the standing posture of prayer is held into the night. The lamps in the dwellings are few and small, a wick floating in a dish of oil, a single flame against the carved or built wall, and the light of them gathers the faces close while the dark fills the rest of the room, and the talk is low, the day's small business, the coming feast, the state of the cisterns, the pilgrims newly arrived, and the roads they came by. The families that serve the place gather to their own fires, and the smoke of the evening cooking rises thin into the dusk and fades against the darkening sky, and the smell of it, of the bread and the wood smoke and the spice, hangs in the trenches with the cooler air that settles down into them as the warmth of the day drains off. Pilgrims, who have spent the day moving from church to church, descending the trenches and passing through the cut tunnels, touching the worn stone and standing at the loud thresholds, settle now into the rock-cut chambers and the passages where they lodge, finding their places along the carved recesses, and the murmur of their talk and their prayer joins the sounds of the closing town. The sunk courts hold the warmth of the day a little longer than the open ground above, for the rock that took the sun through the bright hours gives it back slowly into the evening, and so the pits are, for a time after sunset, gentler than the frost-prone slopes around them, a held warmth in the cooling highland night. As the dark deepens, the lamps in the churches become the brightest things in the place, points and pools of light down in the rock, while the sky above goes from the long highland dusk to the hard clarity of the night, and the stars at this elevation stand out sharp and many in the thin, clear air. The chant slows and ends, the curtains are drawn across the sanctuaries, the last prayers are said, and the clergy withdraw to their cells, and one by one the lamps are tended down or carried away, so that the carved interiors return to the even cool darkness of the deep rock, holding the smell of the wax and the oil and the old smoke through the night. Above, on the level of the ground, the cells and the dwellings show their small fires for a while longer, and then those too bank down to coals, and the smoke thins and stops, and the carved town settles into the long quiet of the highland night, the same quiet that the morning breaks again with the office of the dawn. It is the same place described from the other end of the day, the same lamps and the same chant and the same worn floors, the same pilgrims and the same priests, but the direction of it is reversed, the light withdrawing instead of growing, the warmth gathering down into the pits instead of burning off them, the sounds of the settlement closing instead of waking. And in that reversal, there is the whole rhythm of the place, the breathing in and the breathing out of an ordinary day in a town carved into the rock, the singing rising at dawn out of the ground and rising again at dusk, the lamps lit and tended down and lit again, the cool of the deep stone holding steady through all of it, while the light and the warmth and the voices come and go above it in their daily turning. The whole carved town was laid out as a model of the Holy Land, and to walk through it was to walk, in small and in stone, the geography of the Scriptures without ever leaving the highlands. The two clusters of churches, the northern group and the eastern, are divided by a watercourse cut down into the rock, and that watercourse was named the Jordan, the river of the Holy Land, carried in name and in carved channel into the Lasta heights, so that the carved town has its own Jordan running between its halves, as the holy country had its river running through it. Set among the chapels and the churches are the stations of that transposed geography, a Bethlehem and a Golgotha, and a tomb named for Adam, the places of the sacred story given carved form and fixed location, so that the pilgrim moving through the trenches and the tunnels passed from one holy place to the next, as a pilgrim in the far country would have passed from shrine to shrine. The calendar of the Highland Church set the great occasions of this geography, the feast of the birth at the turning of the year, kept in the deep cold of the dry season, and the feast of the baptism that followed it, when the tabots were carried out of their churches under the bright ceremonial cloths and the great umbrellas and brought in procession to water, the carved Jordan of the place taking on, at that feast, the office that the far river held in the story. The fasts framed the feasts, the long fast before the spring commemoration of the death and the rising, the fast before the birth, the weekly fasts that ran through the ordinary year, and the rhythm of fasting and feasting set the deep time of the place beneath the daily time of the offices. On the feast days the carved town did not hold its crowds in stillness, but in movement, the processions winding up the trenches and through the tunnels, the drums and the sistra sounding, the crosses and the canopies lifted, the chant carried not in one church but through the whole sunk geography at once. The model of the Holy Land walked and sung and filled with the moving faithful, as the far land itself was walked by the pilgrims who could not reach it. The making of this model was itself the central ritual purpose of the place, the bringing of the Holy Land into reach, and every procession that moved through the churches on the feast days reenacted that bringing, walking the carved Jordan and pausing at the carved Golgotha, treading the geography of redemption in the rock of the home country. Burial was woven into the place from its beginning, for the carvers cut recesses and chambers into the rock for the dead, and the bodies of revered clergy and of pilgrims who had come far to die in the holy town were laid in the dry rock chambers, where the even cool of the deep stone preserved them, so that the carved town held its dead among its churches, as the Holy Land held its tombs among its shrines. The passages and the tunnels that join one church to the next are part of the ritual fabric, and not only the practical one, for they carried the processions from station to station, dark-cut ways through the rock that brought the walker out of the daylight of one pit and into the daylight of the next, a passage through the stone that mirrored the passages of the sacred story. The liturgy that filled these spaces was the liturgy of the Ethiopian church, ancient and elaborate, sung in the old language of Ge'ez, that the people no longer spoke, but that the church preserved as the tongue of its worship, carried on the beat of the great drums and the dry rhythmic shaking of the sistrum, and the slow swaying movement of the robed clergy holding their staves and their hand crosses. On the great feasts the chant swelled and the processions formed, and the carved town filled with the crowds, come up from the country around and from the far reaches of the kingdom, the courts and the trenches packed with the standing faithful, the singing carrying up out of every pit at once, the crosses lifted, and the umbrellas of the clergy bright in the hard highland light. And on the ordinary mornings and evenings the same liturgy moved through the same spaces with only the clergy and the few to hear it, the chant rising at dawn and at dusk out of the rock, whether the crowds were there or not, the daily office and the great feast being two intensities of the one continuous worship that was the reason the place was made. The ritual and the rule of the place were not separate, for the kings who ordered the churches into being were Christian kings who held their authority as the defenders and the builders of the faith, and the carved holy city was at once a work of devotion and a work of kingship, the wealth and the labor of a realm poured into the making of a sacred geography. But what the rock holds now of all this is not the kingship which passed, but the worship which did not. The carved Jordan still running between the church groups, the carved Golgotha still standing, the dead still in their rock chambers, the liturgy in the old language still moving through the hollowed stone on the feast days and on the ordinary mornings, the same slow chant rising out of the same pits that it has risen from across the long, unbroken succession of the years. The year in the Lasta highlands turns on water, on the coming and the going of a single long rainy season that governs the whole rhythm of the country and of the carved town within it. Through the dry months, the long stretch from the close of one rains to the opening of the next, the slopes go brown, and the streams in the valleys shrink to threads or to dry beds of stone. The ground hardens, the dust rises on the roads, and the cold of the dry season nights bites hard at this elevation, whitening the open ground with frost before the sun comes up to burn it off into another bright, hard day. Then in the middle of the year the rains break, gathering against the heights through June and falling through the high summer into September, filling the streams in the valleys, softening the slopes into green, and pouring down across the rock of the carved town in the heavy daily downpours of the highland wet season. Those rains were the great enemy of the soft tuff, for water standing against the cut faces of the churches would have worked into the stone and weathered it away, and so the drainage of the place was engineered against the rains with as much care as the churches themselves were carved. The trenches and the courts were graded to carry the water away from the church walls, the cut channels and gutters leading the runoff toward the rock-hewn wells, and the cisterns quarried down into the tuff, so that the same downpours that greened the fields and filled the streams were drawn off from the churches and gathered into store rather than left to pool against the soft walls. In this, the makers of the carved town worked with the season rather than against it, taking the rains that threatened the stone and turning them into the water supply of the place, the cisterns holding through the dry months the water that the wet months brought, so that the deep stone wells of the carved town stood full when the streams of the valleys had shrunk to nothing. One of the rock-cut wells holds water the year round in the deep shaded pit of a church, fed by the seepage of the high ground through the porous tuff. And that standing water in the rock was held holy and drawn for the blessings of the faithful, the geology of the welded scoria, which lets the rain soak slowly through it, turned to the service of the place. The cold of the dry season nights at this elevation is a real cold, the frost lying on the grass of the open slopes, and the breath of the cattle and the singing crowds hanging white in the dawn air, and the carved interiors holding the even temperature of the deep rock, were neither so cold then nor so cool in the warmth of the wet days as the open ground without. The high months of the rains brought their own difficulty to the soft stone beyond the standing water, for the damp worked into the tuff, and the lichens and the mosses crept across the shaded faces, and the long, slow weathering of the rock was above all the work of the wet season, repeated across the centuries. The farming year that turned about the churches set its great labors by the same water, the breaking of the hard ground as the first rains softened it, the sowing of the barley and the wheat and the small hardy grains across the wet months, the long green of the growing season on the slopes, And then the gathering of the harvest into the bright, dry weather, when the threshing floors rang, and the grain went into the rock cut, and the built stores against the dry months to come. The cattle and the goats followed the grass, moved out to the greening higher ground in the wet season, and brought down again as the dry months browned the slopes, and the dung of them was carried back to the fields, and the milk and the butter of them, set aside in the long fasts, returned to the table in the seasons of feasting. So the year had not two faces only, but a whole turning wheel of labors and observances, the water and the grain and the herds and the fasts and the feasts, all moving together through it, the carved town and its surrounding farmland breathing in and out with the single great rhythm of the rains. The farming of the surrounding slopes followed the same turning of the water, the ground broken and the grain sown as the rains came on, the green coming up across the slopes through the wet months, the harvest gathered as the rains ended, and the ground hardened again, the threshing floors busy in the bright, dry weather, the grain carried into store for the long, dry season, and the pilgrimage that filled the carved town followed the dry season rather than the wet, for the great feasts of the church calendar that drew the crowds up from the lowlands came in good measure in the dry months, when the roads up from the country around were passable and hard, and the bright cold weather drew the faithful into the sunk courts in their thousands, the breath of the singing crowds hanging visible in the frosty air. In the wet months the roads turned to mud, and the streams ran high, and the travel of pilgrims slackened, and the carved town drew in upon its own clergy and its own families, the daily office continuing in the rain-loud pits, while the world around went green, and the water poured down the engineered channels into the cisterns. So the year had its two faces in the carved town, as it had across the highlands, the dry face of frost and dust and hard bright roads and crowded feasts, and the wet face of green slopes and full streams, and the rain drumming on the carved roofs and running away down the cut channels. And the place lived differently in each, the same churches and the same liturgy, carried through the turning of the season. The reddish tuff of the churches changed its look with the water, darkening and glistening under the rain, and then drying back to its dusty red in the long months after. And the cisterns rose and sank, full at the end of the rains and slowly drawn down through the dry months until the rains came again. And over all of it stood the steadiness of the deep stone, the carved interiors holding their even cool through both the seasons, neither the frost of the dry nights nor the warmth of the wet days reaching far into the rock, so that the inside of a church kept one temperature through a year that swung hard from frost to downpour and back, the still cool center around which the great wheel of the highland seasons turned. The change that came to the carved town was not a falling, but a shifting, not the emptying of the place, but the draining away from it of the political weight it had briefly carried. The kings who had raised the churches belonged to a line that ruled the highlands for a time, and then gave way, around the close of the 13th century, to a new dynasty that claimed for itself a descent from the kings of the old scriptures, from Solomon and the line of Israel, and that new power moved the center of the kingdom away from the Lasta heights, southward into other regions, to other capitals and other royal seats. The line that had carved the churches is remembered as the Zagwe, and the king for whom the town came at last to be named is held in memory as the greatest of its builders. His life, written up in the later centuries into a hagiography that gathered the deeds and the holiness of the maker of the churches into the form of a saint's life. The dynasty that followed, the restored line that traced itself to Solomon, did not unmake what the Zagwe had carved, and the later kings of the highlands continued at times to honor and to endow the rock churches, even as their courts sat far to the south, so that the place kept a thread of royal regard long after it had ceased to be a seat of rule. What moved away was the center of gravity of the kingdom, the place where the realm was governed and its wealth gathered and its armies mustered. And that center, once it had shifted south, did not return to the Lasta heights again. The shift left its mark in the ground chiefly as a quiet, for the carving of the churches had been the work of a gathered realm, the feeding and the housing and the directing of a great labor force across years of cutting, and that gathering was not repeated once the court had gone. The later centuries added their small works to the place, a chapel here, a wall or a repair there, the slow accretion of a living holy site, but nothing again of the order of the 11 churches, nothing that needed the wealth and the command of a kingdom center. The monastic life settled into its long steadiness, the clergy holding the offices and keeping the books and tending the lamps, the families about them serving the place across the generations, the pilgrims arriving and departing with the feasts, and the town carried on in this way as a holy place is carried on, by continuance rather than by building. So the record of the change is not a layer of ash or a line of broken walls, but a thinning of the documents that speak of power and a steadiness in the things that speak of worship. The carved town slipping out of the history of the kingdom's rule, while it held its place in the kingdom's faith. The carved town, which had been for a season a place of kings, became thereafter a provincial holy place rather than a seat of rule, and the court that had ordered the churches into being, that had fed the long labor of the carving and gathered the wealth that paid for it, passed away to the south and into the memory of the place rather than its present. But the churches were not abandoned, and they did not fall. For the reason the place existed was never the court but the worship, and the worship continued. The clergy remained, keeping the offices in the rock interiors at the dawn and the dusk, as they had kept them under the kings, and the pilgrims kept coming up the highland roads to walk the carved Jordan and to stand at the carved Golgotha, and the feasts kept their crowds, so that the daily and the yearly life of the carved town went on through the change of dynasties with little break. What drained away was the kind of importance that leaves its mark in the records of power, the presence of the court, the gathering of the realm's wealth, the standing of the place as a capital, and the centuries that followed saw that kind of weight settle elsewhere, in the regions to which the new line had carried the kingdom's center. The carved town receded in the chronicles even as it endured on the ground, becoming a holy place visited and revered and kept, but no longer a place where the kingdom was governed or its wealth amassed. There is no layer of burning to read here, and no sign of a violent end, for the place was not unmade, and its people were not driven out. What the rock records of this passage is mostly an absence, the absence of the great new works that the years of the kings had brought. For after the carving of the churches, the place added little to itself of that scale, and the energy that had hollowed 11 churches out of the mountain was not gathered again. The town settled into the long steadiness of a holy place that is kept rather than built, the clergy maintaining what the kings had made, the pilgrims wearing the rock floors a little smoother with each generation, the cisterns filling and emptying with the seasons, the chant rising at dawn and dusk out of the unchanging stone. And so the decline of the carved town, if the word can be used at all of a place that never ceased to be itself, was only the quiet withdrawal of one kind of importance and the long continuance of another, the kingship moving south and fading into the chronicles, while the worship stayed in the rock. The carved holy city outliving by many centuries the dynasty that had carved it, holding its form and its purpose against the years as the hardened tuff held its carved edges against the rain. The 11 churches still stand in their pits and their trenches, sunk into the reddish ground of the Lasta heights as they were carved, and they are not ruins, for they have never ceased to be what they were made to be. The clergy of the Ethiopian Orthodox community keep the offices in them still, the chant rising at dawn and at dusk out of the rock as it has risen across the long succession of the centuries. And at the great feasts the courts and the trenches fill once more, with the crowds come up from the country around, the white-robed faithful packing the sunk courts, the crosses lifted, the singing carrying up out of every pit at once into the hard highland light. The rock floors are worn smooth and a little hollowed by the passage of bare feet across so many generations of worship, and the painted interiors still hold their figures of the saints in the moving light of the lamps, the reds and the yellows and the blacks of the old mineral colors dimmed but legible on the plastered walls. The soft tuff has paid its slow price to the weather across the centuries, the cut faces eroding grain by grain under the rains, and over several of the churches shelters have been raised in recent times to turn the rain and slow the weathering of the stone, structures that stand above the pits and cover the carved roofs, plain against the old worked rock. The carved town was set among the first places of the world to be named for their value to all people, recognized in the later 20th century as a site to be kept for its worth beyond the country that holds it. And the keeping of it has been a long and careful business, weighed between the need to shelter the eroding stone and the wish to leave the churches as they were carved, in the open air of their pits. At the Feast of the Birth, kept in the deep cold of the highland dry season, the town fills as it has always filled, the pilgrims coming up in their tens of thousands along the old roads, the white-robed crowds packing the slopes above the pits and the trenches between the churches, the chant rising through the cold night, and the candles, many in the dark, the carved holy city carrying still, 8 centuries on, the office for which it was subtracted from the rock. The study of the place goes on alongside the worship, the conservators reading the weathering of the scoria and the cracks that the centuries have opened, the historians reading the chronicles and the saint's life and the endowments of the later kings, the whole long record of a town that has never stopped being itself. The place is studied now through the very stone it was cut from, through the geology of the welded scoria and the way it hardens and weathers, through the chisel marks and the quarrying scars that record the method and the order of the carving, and through the documentary traces of the kings who are remembered as its builders, the kings of the line that ruled the highlands before the southern dynasty rose. The engineered drainage still does its work, the cut channels and the graded courts still carrying the rains away from the walls and into the rock-hewn wells, the cisterns still rising with the wet season and falling through the dry as they have always done. And of all the churches, it is the one set apart on its southern terrace that holds the eye at the end of the day, Bete Georgis, the cross-cut hole from the rock, standing alone in its deep squared pit with the carved cross of its roof lying level with the surrounding ground. In the long light of the highland dusk, when the crowds have thinned and the chant has settled into the quiet of the evening office, the church is most easily seen by coming to the lip of the pit and looking down onto the cross-shaped roof set level with the soil, down the sheer walls into the shadowed court at the foot of the cross, the whole church held below the level of the ground in the cooling air. The stones remain. The reddish tuff of the Lasta heights still carries the form that the carvers freed from it. The hollowed naves and the ranks of columns and the carved Jordan running between the church groups, the whole sunk holy city folded into the mountain as it was folded 8 centuries ago, and the chant still rises from it at the dusk, and the light goes slowly off the carved cross of Bete Georgis, level with the ground, while the cold of the highland night gathers down into the pits, and the lamps come up one by one in the rock.